welcome to the third webinar of the Queensland AI Hub Medical Datathon webinar series. Today, you can probably tell we don't just have two speakers, we have a panel of 4 very intelligent, talented people that I'm really looking forward to questioning and hearing their answers on some interesting topics. So we're going to get started very shortly. I'll just let everyone jump onto the webinar. So let me introduce everyone to you first. So today on our panel, we have Dr. David Hanson. So David Hanson is the CEO of the Australian eHealth Research Centre, which is a joint venture between the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, CSIRO, and Queensland Health and CSIRO's National Digital Health Research Program. So David leads a research program of over 100 scientists and engineers developing information and communication technologies to improve the safety, quality and efficiency of healthcare. The eHealth research program tackles the challenges of the healthcare system across data, diagnosis and services. David is also the chair of the Health Informatics Society of Australia, and David is passionate about the role of information and communication technologies in healthcare and the role of health informatics professionals in developing a safe, high quality, efficient and sustainable healthcare system in Australia. So that's David. Then we have Dr. Sally Shrapnel. So Sally is a senior lecturer in physics and data science at the University of Queensland, whose research focuses on the interface between causality and machine learning. She's also a registered medical practitioner with 20 years clinical experience and the AI lead for the COVID-19 Critical Care Consortium, a clinical study encompassing 400 hospitals across 48 countries aiming to understand the effects of COVID-19 in ICU patients. So very relevant. Lucy Shinners is an experienced intensive care nurse who has worked in Australia and overseas for the past 20 years. Lucy now contributes to the development of Australia's future healthcare workforce as a nursing lecturer and course coordinator at Southern Cross University. As an educator, Lucy has observed the growing use of technology in the classroom as well as the healthcare system, impacting the journey of the student, the workforce and the patient. Lucy's PhD pursuits are focused on exploring healthcare professionals' experiences and perceptions of artificial intelligence in the delivery of care. She's published and actively engages in research projects and communities exploring the space, including the Young Women in AI Networking Group and Queensland AI Hub. And then we have Dr. Mengling Feng. So Dr. Feng is currently an assistant professor at the Institute for Data Science, National University of Singapore, and the senior assistant director of the National University Hospital, championing the big data analytics efforts. His research is to develop machine learning algorithms to extract actionable knowledge from a large amount of data to enable better quality of healthcare. His research brings together the concepts and tools across deep learning, health optimization, signal processing, statistical causal inference, and big data management. Dr. Feng's work was recognized by both well-established journals, such as Science Direct. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and Mengling from Singapore. So appreciate you tuning in. So we'll get started with our first question. How do you see data as a way of connecting worlds of healthcare professionals and data scientists? So we'll start with Lucy Shinners.
Thank you, Steph, for inviting me to this. This is very exciting. So I guess when I thought about this question, I thought as a clinician, and you'll probably find that most of my answers are given with this really human focus. So, you know, the clinical setting, it's really been changing with the creation of a data-driven healthcare system. And I think that clinicians are aware that they're creating a lot of data, but they haven't really seen how the data can inform their practice and improve care delivery at the bedside. They're beginning to understand that, and I think with the development of health informatics, that's really coming to the front. I think that the amazing work that our data scientists are starting to do in the field of AI is really going to give life to that data, and clinicians will need to understand the value of data in the future so that they can then close that loop and enter data more accurately at the bedside as well. And I think that if that's done correctly and we introduce AI, which has the correct context and accuracy, then we're going to see, you know, an improvement in the quality of data as clinicians see that they have an important role as well in all of that. So I guess, you know, I think it's really important to mention that the way that that we connect healthcare and data science is really important to ensure that all of our projects are created with the representation from both worlds. Data scientists can't create innovation without context from the clinician, and the clinician can't make that innovation happen without, you know, the expertise of our data scientists. So they need to, you know, we both need to be there from the beginning, and otherwise, you know, I think we'll waste a lot of time and we'll probably offer things that aren't relevant at the bedside as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Meng Ling, did you want to address that next?
Sorry, forgot to unmute. Yeah, thanks for having me. Greetings from Singapore. So yeah, related to this topic about data, I started researching in machine learning, data analytics, or AI like about 15 years ago. Based on my own experience, I would say that scientists nowadays are very lucky, because 15 years back, we basically have no data, right? The whole world's data scientists are just working about a handful of public available data and keep publishing paper, churning out almost meaningless information from the 10 public data set over and over again. Nowadays, we are lucky that because electronic medical records is very widely adopted, so we do see huge amount of data being collected from the healthcare domain. But at the same time, it's very interesting. Although we have been collecting large amount of data, but in healthcare is so special, such a domain, that if you dive into a specific study, you will soon realize that we actually don't have a big data problem, and you actually realize we still lack of data. Let me give you an example. For example, for our hospital, we have over 10 years of electronic medical record, like millions of patients' data. Right? We thought we have big data, but once if we focus on a particular disease, focusing on the adverse event of particular treatments, and removing some exclusion criteria, removing some confounding effects, and removing data points with low data quality, you will soon realize you're only left with a couple hundred data points, right? Your data shrinks so quickly. So at that point, I will also often suggest or warn my clinical partners choose our machine learning methods or statistical methods accordingly. Because of course, AIs and deep learning has been a very exciting topic nowadays. Everyone wants to do something related to AI and deep learning, right? But then when they approach me with only like less than 100 data points, I would then feedback to them saying that probably your problem, first of all, don't have enough data to support a deep learning model. And secondly, probably it's not complicated enough for us to bring all these big cannons, right? So let's choose the right tools to solve the right problems. It's not necessary that every time we have to throw in the most sexy and most complicated models to impress everyone. But yeah, but in short, I think we are in the best era. And second is that even we have huge amount of data, we still need to pick the right model for the right problem that we are solving. Cheers.
Yep, fantastic. And David, would you like to answer that next?
Sure. So look, I think we're talking about connecting worlds of healthcare professionals and data scientists. And I think that one thing that we've found over the years of working with clinicians is that clinicians are actually information scientists. You know, they actually, when they've got a patient in front of them, their brain, which I've always found is simply amazing, can process information in ways that I certainly couldn't. And so I think you know, they just naturally get many of the concepts of data and information science that we talk to them about as, you know, data scientists or an information scientist. We talk to them about concepts of data quality and AI and knowledge representation and even, you know, machine learning and deep learning, and they just naturally get it. because I think they are information scientists. That's the way they diagnose patients and choose the best treatments and all the things that they do when they're treating patients. And so there's kind of a natural, there is already a natural relationship between an information scientist or data scientist and the clinicians that we work with. So the team I lead within CSIRO, we're now 17 years old. We've been around for 17 years and we've worked with a lot of clinicians, and that's a really important part of what we do. We're a digital program. Everyone has some sort of computer science or mathematical or biomedical engineering, increasingly health informatics background. And so the challenge for us is to make sure that what we do and the solutions that we develop are really deeply anchored into the challenges of the healthcare system. And we do that by collaborating with clinicians and health service executives to make sure that that what we do is appropriate and correct and safe and high quality and all those things, but also can be implemented in the healthcare system. So that's a really important part of what we do at CSIRO. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't think the health system itself has challenges. And I think we probably won't get across all of those today. I do want to make some comments about workforce, and one of the issues I see in Australia, I don't know actually what it's like in Singapore, is that we don't have a really strong digital health workforce. We have a strong and getting stronger AI workforce, but those people who understand both digital and health and really get down and implement things, we don't have enough of those. We've been doing some work with the University of Queensland IT department actually to introduce a digital health course for IT, for third-year IT students here. And actually we've managed to make that link through to the UQ Medical School, where we're working with the UQ Medical School to introduce some of the digital health concepts, some concepts around digital health into the curriculum. And we're doing that through their case-based learning program. And so, so I think there's a workforce issue, which is a big issue, and why I'm particularly involved in what used to be HISA, what is now the Australasian Institute for Digital Health here in Australia. And look, there's the health world is going to be increasingly data driven. We've got this world of genomics coming, and if we don't think we've got enough clinicians who understand digital and digital who don't understand health, we don't have anywhere near the number of pathologists and genetic pathologists and counsellors and things that we're going to need once genomics hits the mainstream. So as a final comment, AI is a much bigger world than machine learning. And so here at the Australian Health Research Centre, we certainly, and CSIRO, we certainly do a lot of work around machine learning, but there's a whole, in AI, there's kind of a statistical end to artificial intelligence around machine learning and deep learning, but there's a whole knowledge representation end or symbolic artificial intelligence, which depends on first order mathematics and description logic and things, which is really represented in some of the things which underpin our electronic medical records, whether that's clinical terminology or our information models or data models that we use to exchange information. And we do a lot of that work here at the centre as well. So AI is a huge world. Bringing it to health is a great fun, but also it's fabulous working with some of the clinicians or information scientists, as I like to think of them.
Excellent. That's a really interesting point about the connection, making it early. So, while future clinicians are still studying, already getting them to think about the potential there. So that's a really interesting answer. Sally, I'd love to hear from you next.
Yes, so thanks, Steph. So everyone's given such fantastic answers, and I would agree with everything that everyone said, particularly David, who really stole my thunder, because, I was thinking about how do, these worlds of data scientists and health professionals connect? And from my perspective, having worked in both fields, really both worlds are very data driven. So I would 100% agree with David. As a doctor, when you approach a patient, you're collecting data instantly. You know, you're watching their gait as they walk into your room, you're making assessments about their expression, about the question they ask, you're gathering data constantly, and then you're framing that within the perspective of all the data you've gathered during your training, during your experience as a doctor, the publications you've read, the colleagues you've spoken to, the conferences you've gone to, etc. And then you make a decision. And I think there is a very natural fit between the way data scientists approach problems and the way doctors approach problems. And I think that's just reflective of the way humans gather information and make decisions. So perhaps the worlds aren't so far apart as we think. I think the biggest difference obviously is language and ways of expressing ideas. As data scientists, we're typically trained in mathematics and programming languages and various ways of describing what we know about data and what is interesting to us about data. And as health professionals, we're trained to express it using words and English language and descriptions, etc. What I've found is that there is just this huge appetite in both fields for shared language and for collaboration. And I think that's particularly among younger medics that I meet. Everyone who's doing their training in a specialty or whatever wants to do some module on machine learning or understand computer programming, or, you know, the accessibility to data science has improved greatly. And I think that that means that there are a lot of younger people, graduates, etc., who are really keen, nurses and doctors and all health professionals who are really keen to educate themselves and get a better education around data science. And I think from the other perspective, data scientists are humans who care about their health, right? So I think there is a lot of motivation as a data scientist. If you're working on a health-related problem, you really do have a bit of extra motivation and vested interest often. I found that working on this big coronavirus project, we were absolutely inundated with offers of help from data scientists. And it wasn't just because they wanted to help, it was a good cause, etc., but everyone just wants to know about this disease and what's going to happen and how can we all be involved. So I think the worlds perhaps aren't so far apart as we think. I think they are being connected. I think shared language is crucial, and data visualizations and good data visualizations can be key to helping those relationships, because although we might not speak the same language in words, we often do in pictures. People get visualizations often much faster than they get, you know, an equation or a bunch of medical jargon. And I guess in terms of connecting in other areas, as David was saying, it's, you know, critically important that we start educating the next generation well. And David will have to speak after this, because we're looking at putting together a grad cert in digital health for medical students, etc. I mean, I think there's a lot of movement across all the universities to try and address this problem of educating health professionals, and also within data scientists putting in modules, specific, you know, courses that are aligned with helping data scientists work in a health context.
Yeah, great answers from all of you. And I think what I'm really hearing is that the gap between, you know, the clinician and the data scientist isn't as big as some people may feel. And it's just supporting each of them to see how similar their motives are and what they do in their everyday jobs, such as problem solving and analyzing data, are not that different. It's like you said, it's just matching up that language and understanding what it is that we're trying to do. So very good. That's very positive. So let's move on to our next question. What do you think are the challenges in ensuring a smooth handover in both directions?
Did you want me to go first?
Sorry, we'll start with Lucy. Yeah, we can.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I can only speak from my limited experience in starting to become a part of these teams that are a mix of clinicians and data scientists. So I'll sort of speak from that perspective. A couple of things. One of the biggest things I think you need to establish from the outset is your expectations of the roles of the individuals that are part of the team. You need an understanding of their capabilities and what their knowledge is. and also be quite flexible about that. I think that the right person needs to be chosen for the right area. So, you know, when you're creating a piece of technology, you need to think about who is the end user, because it's more than likely that you need them as a part of your team to make sure that what you're creating is applicable to that person who's going to be using it. I think that so it's really important to understand, you know, the persona of the user, but also you need to adjust your expectations of what can be achieved from the data. So sometimes you'll have a really great idea as a clinician, but you can't necessarily represent that in the way that you want to with the data, and you need to be creative about how you can come up with an answer that is going to, you know, be suitable for your team. And I think the communication is extremely important within these teams. You know, people don't know what they don't know, and that comes to both sides of the expertise until you communicate properly and you ask questions and you admit that you don't know things and you observe where your knowledge gaps are. And, you know, I think for speaking from a clinical side of things, for the data scientists, don't assume that clinicians don't want to know how you got a system to function the way that it did. There might be some information that, you know, you withhold, but actually it might be really important to that clinician to understand how you went through that process so that they can make sure it's not too far removed from what the end product will be. And then I guess, you know, the context of the project is really very important. I think if you're a subject matter expert on the team, coming from that clinical side, you're constantly drawn upon to interpret that data and make connections for the team. So it means that you need to know your industry really well and have, you know, really good experience that you bring to the team. So that can be a challenge if you don't have the right people sitting in the right spots to really help with that team. So that's what I'd add to it from my experience.
Fantastic. And Mingling?
Okay. Yeah, I understand that this question is about smooth handover from both ends. But I rather to see the process not so much of handing over, but pretty much echoing what all of the previous panelists said, more like a co-inventing process and handing over, because it won't be like the physicians hand over the problem to the data scientists and the data scientists hand over back the result. It's not really that's what's happening, but rather than two teams really sit next to each other, like co-developing the whole process. And it's going to be a very iterative process requiring effective and multiple iteration or interactions among both teams. And let me share some of my personal experience where kind of my healthcare machine learning or AI research start growing very fast. I did my postdoc at Harvard MIT Health Science Technology Institute or division. It was a cool experience, not just because it carries names of two famous universities, but rather it's a very unique setup that I don't observe in many places in the world, including Singapore. It was a combined institute between the School of Medicine from Harvard and the School of Engineering from MIT, kind of combining two of the best schools in the world. And it was so well integrated, like in my lab, lab of computational biology, physiology, LCP, the lab that created Mimicry, some of you are using today. So in our lab, 50%, about half of the members are physicians, still practicing in hospitals, in sort of the Harvard affiliated hospitals, and the other half are like me, data scientists. And we sit next to each other, right? Intentionally, there's no segregation between data scientists and physicians. And we work. How we work together is that, like, for example, for ICU data, Mimic is about ICU. So while our clinical director, Dr. Leo, he is on duty in the ICU, he will sort of invite us, right? Invite, no, he invite with food, right? After that, he will treat us for lunch. He will invite all the data scientists to join him for rounds in the morning. That's very, very eye-opening experience for data scientists, right? Because now we start to understand, okay, so this data point in Mimic, right, is actually how it was documented, right? Then you realize in today's big data era, a lot of your big data actually happens on a piece of tissue by the nurses, right? Because exactly, because they're so busy, right? It's not that like every day they have time to go to the workstation and put in things so timely, right? They put a lot of things in piece of paper, right? Sometimes even napkins. Only when they're changing shift, right? And then now they record the memory and then they put in some timestamps on those data. So now you really understand how the data was generated and what it means for the patient and also for the physicians while watching this data. And reciprocally, for the physicians who sit next to us, and while so that we can ask them questions very interactively, then they start to understand how the computer scientists or the geeks that see the world as an engineering problem, right? Because one important task for this chemistry to happen is that we are able to transform a already very complicated healthcare challenge into a computer science or engineering problem, and we try to solve it with our tools. And that translation is not a trivial task. It actually requires knowledge from both ends, as our previous panelists mentioned. And that can only happen when I have a physician friend sitting next to me. Then whenever I have doubt, I ask him, and he starts to understand how I think. And sometimes he can even help me to formulate part of it for me. And that chemistry really makes it very successful. And that's why we observe, and that's why we sort of started the first Datathon in MIT in 2015. And the whole concept is to bring the two community under one roof and let them interact very intensively over the weekend through this Datathon. So yeah, and so that's why I'm very happy to be invited to be a panel for this Datathon. And I hope this chemistry can go beyond just a 2 weekends of the Datathon, but rather slowly build into our daily research life with whatever mechanism that works for your country. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And that's what we're hoping with the Datathon, that it's not just limited to the event, but that, you know, it is a powerful event for people to connect and see what can be done. And we do hope that everyone continues beyond the Datathon. So it's a good point. And yeah, that's part of the handover is giving exposure of both sides to the other side, essentially, and understanding, you know, what goes on. Especially the data collection. It's interesting that you say about, you know, some things are written on a napkin, or because, you know, the first point is the data collection, and that's a really important aspect that can sometimes be forgotten, is how is the data collected and what implications does that have for the results that are obtained from these tools. So yeah, excellent point. David, I'd like to hear from you.
Find the mute button. I agree with Lucy and Mei-Ling's talk point so far. I think I think where I want to go with this question is how we actually close the implementation loop. And so, you know, a lot of times researchers and data scientists will do some work with a clinician, and then to actually get it and it'll be you know, produce a really nice result. Maybe result in a paper. And I think the point around the health informatics and digital health initiative worlds is how we actually get that into practical use, and how we actually you know, take it from a piece of really nice research into something which the clinician is using at the front line to make a difference to how they're treating the treating patients. And before, when I said that I think clinicians are really great information scientists, they are, but they're still limited. And so, you know, we've only got so many neural networks in our brain to get information and synthesize it with the patient we're looking at. And so having digital tools is how increasingly our clinicians will more efficiently and provide care and provide care with higher safety and quality. And so that's what's exciting me about the whole world of digital health at the moment, is some of the initiatives we're seeing around how we actually close that gap between research and implementation. And I'm afraid that, you know, and this is where clinicians may not like me, is that unfortunately or fortunately or whatever, you know, it is through the use of electronic medical records, and how we actually go from electronic medical records, which are just data capture mechanisms, to electronic medical records which which are almost smart platforms, which allow for new apps to be added to them, which support clinicians in particular use cases and particular worlds. And we're lucky, we live in 2020, well, maybe not so lucky with 2020, but you know, this era where we have great information tools and we're able to use Zoom and sit in different parts of the world and communicate. Health's always been both in front and behind with, I think, with digital technologies. And you know, some they're way out in front with new medical imaging and genomic sequencing machines and other things, and probably in the electronic medical world a little bit behind. And so if we look at what's happened with mobile phones, for instance, and the whole world of, you know, smart apps on our phones that we all use, you know, I think that's a world which will come to electronic medical records in the future. And we're now starting to see some of those standards which will allow that to happen emerge and become part of electronic medical records. The one in particular that we use and that we've been working with is FHIR, the Fast Healthcare Interoperable Resources from HL7, and the Smart on FHIR application network that builds on top of that. That's really taken off in America, and you know, we do see Smart on FHIR apps appearing in the Epic and Cerner electronic medical records in the American environment. They haven't quite made it as far as Australia yet, but that's, as I mentioned before, with the work we're doing with the University of Queensland Medical School on their case-based learning. We've built that whole framework around the Smart on FHIR platform. And so that when our IT students build a Smart on FHIR app, which might you know, be a growth chart or a cancer staging tool or some sort of calculation like that, it can actually sit inside the framework we've built for the medical students to do their case-based learning. So, you know, it's a really nice example, of education, digital understanding health, and hopefully medical students starting to get some digital concepts, but also really showing that you know, the future of medical records is around apps, whether it's the Smart on FHIR app framework or not, and probably not. It's certainly the one out in front at the moment. And so I think, you know, really closing that gap between the research and then how we get it used at the clinical coalface is going to be something really important over the next few years.
Excellent. And Sally?
Yeah, so I can speak to that last point that David was making. Well, a number of points that you were making, David. With respect to that little bit of reticence that clinicians have sometimes to adopt, for example, EMRs, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it really goes to the heart of one of the biggest challenges with handover between clinicians and data scientists. And the first thing is that we're using this word handover. So it's like someone has responsibility for something and then hands it to someone else, and then someone else has responsibility for something. Whereas I think really what
totally agree, Sally.
Really what we need to engender is a sense of shared responsibility for the final outcomes. And the final outcomes we all agree on, and that is better patient care. So, and the data scientists agree with that, and the clinicians agree with that. But I think this old-fashioned way that we had of, you know, a clinician would collect some data from a clinical trial, they'd boot it over the fence to the statisticians would work away and get some p-values, etc. They'd send it back, and then the clinicians would make the decision about whether it was going to be published, and then ultimately there'd be, you know, a few iterations, and then maybe we're going to use it in clinical practice. And what happens then is ultimately it's the clinician, and there is this sense that the final responsibility always rests with the clinician. If you're going to make a decision based on an EMR or some other, that you're the one that's taking responsibility for that patient care. And the digital health professionals who are involved in developing that decision point are no longer responsible. And I think that's wrong. I think that there should be built-in shared responsibility when we build a project. Everybody who's involved in the production of the product should feel that they are accountable, and that they have a shared responsibility to deliver the final result, which is patient care. How do we do that? It's really difficult because legally, obviously, we don't have a framework set up to make those responsibilities clear. I think probably the first thing is that when you're setting up a project, that people are incredibly respectful for everybody in the team, all the interdisciplinary members, what they can bring to solving the problem. That's not just doctors and data scientists, but it's the nurses, the ethicists, the OTs, the people who set up the data frameworks, the people who do the data cleaning. And it's that sense of a team that have shared responsibility for the outcome, I think, that will help move these things forward. Because at the moment, as a clinician, you're reluctant to put new things into place. If, for example, so I would think if I was working in a hospital and someone came and said, hey, guess what, everyone, we're going digital tomorrow, I'd be really anxious because I would think, how's that going to impact my workflow? And when I've got a patient in front of me that's really, really sick and I need an X-ray result or a blood pressure and I need it like that, if it doesn't work, I feel responsible. You know, I feel I can't look after that patient anymore. I can't do my job properly. Whereas if I've been, you know, if I know that whole team is responsible all the way through, I think will lead to better outcomes. Anyway, that's my little rant over.
Fabulous point, Sally. And look, it's one of the biggest issues facing digital health is that there's fabulous work going on, and we do a lot of really great work with clinicians. And the hardest thing is to have a successful project with a clinician because you've got that shared responsibility. You've built the project together, you've done the implementation trial, you've shown great outcomes, and then you go, why isn't everyone adopting it? And you've hit the nail on the head. And I once asked a guy called Hal Wolf III, who's the CEO and president of HIMSS in America, but used to be the CIO of Kaiser Permanente, which is one of the biggest health management systems or health insurers, as we'd call them, in the US, across 4 states. And I once said, how does Kaiser Permanente take an innovation which happens locally and make it work across the system? And he said, and his answer was really instructive. He said, the top innovation award at Kaiser Permanente goes to the team which picks up an innovation from one place and implements it in their place. And so we really have to think, I think, about how we view digital health innovations and how we do try and make them systematized because Sally's totally right. You know, clinicians are very smart and we've talked about how they're information scientists anyway, and they really need to trust the tools that they're using. And so, look, that's a really great point, Sally, and given me something to think about over the weekend, and ties into some other things that, you know, obviously we've been thinking about.
Can I just add to that, and it will probably lead into your last question anyway, Steph, but a lot of what you're talking about is exactly what I'm trying to pursue in my PhD, and that is exploring that whole adoption and acceptance piece, and how you end up getting the clinician to use it and to use it safely. And I think the thing that keeps coming up to me in the literature is, you know, well, there's a couple of things, but, you know, there's this whole approach of needing to understand the organization you're putting it into, the people that are going to use it and the technology, and how the relationships work between the 3 of them. And so I think that anyone who's trying to implement needs to understand those 3 parts first before successful implementation can occur. The other thing that's becoming really evident, and some of my work will start to show that, is that it just keeps coming back to education, understanding that, you know, the clinical workforce, understanding how this technology works and will benefit them. And so that when these innovations present themselves, if whoever's a part of that team can become like a shining light, you know, someone who sort of guides that way. And there's a word for it, but I can't think of it. I think that, you know, there's this trust that will come, and then you build that with your understanding. You've got support from your organisation and the culture that's been set in the organisation, and it all sort of works together towards this implementation. And perhaps we haven't done that well enough yet in the past, but I think I'm starting to look towards it for the future. So yeah.
I do think that there's one thing that we don't speak about enough, and that is the fact that even though we're in this very high stakes health environment, it's okay to make mistakes and to fail, and that's a really risky thing to say in a health environment. You're meant to never make a mistake, right? But you look at any of the great medical advances. So hip replacements, it's one of modern medicine's most successful operations. It saves thousands and thousands of people, years and years of awful pain. It's a very successful and safe operation. The early years of hip replacements were just a disaster. I mean, really. And, you know, you wouldn't have wanted to adopt an early hip replacement, but for any change, any new innovation, there will be some teething problems. And I think this is the reason why health, you know, David was saying health is often a bit behind the rest of the tech world. I mean, you look at what's happening in finance and banking, and you think, how come we're still writing stuff on Post-it notes and sending faxes in the hospital? This is really embarrassing. Why can't healthcare get with the program? But I think it's partly that reluctance to be prepared for things not to be perfect for a while. But I think we are going to have to, you know, in as safe a way as possible, and as with many guardrails, etc. But we will have to actually move forward and put electronic health systems in, and be aware that things will be a bit slower. We might make gains in some areas, and in some areas, health outcomes may not be as good for a period of time. And whether or not as a community we're prepared to accept that, that's a big ask, and that's something that obviously should be debated more widely. But I think that's going to be that is a kind of barrier to getting across that. We build something terrific, it looks great, and everyone's too scared to actually put it into practice in case it's not perfect. You know, and I think maybe that's probably preventing a bit of progress. So, I mean, again, you know, we're getting better at having shadow systems and you know, building mirror databases so we can actually look at things and have them not implement patient care. But at some point, we're just going to have to bite the bullet and start using things. So how we do that as a community in a way that is palatable to the community is something that's interesting and worth investigation. I guess I just want to go back to that one point that I'd like to hear from Lucy and Mengling and David what they think, and that is just that real key thing of respect. I think it's really crucial amongst you know, all the people working in this area, that they maintain a respect for what everyone has to bring to the table. Because I do see sometimes, you know, clinicians are very busy, and they often, you know, you've got 20 minutes of my time, that's it. And there is a sense often from the clinical workforce that they are more time poor than the rest of the digital health workforce. I know that's a controversial thing to say. And I think, having worked in both fields, I know the pressure of needing to see patients and needing to be there caring for people, and your time is very precious. But I think everybody's time is precious, and that clinicians need to prioritize spending time with data scientists to make sure we get this right. And it's just as important as scheduling in another outpatient's clinic or what have you, is actually making time for hospitals and clinical staff to engage with data scientists and the digital health part of their infrastructure in hospital. Anyway, I'd be interested to see what other people think about that.
Yeah, well, I agree. And I think, again, you know, on my last point, that's up to the organisation to allow that to occur in a lot of instances, particularly for the nurse at the bedside or whatever. If they don't get given the in-service and the, you know, there's an organisational culture to go and learn and embrace that stuff, it doesn't happen. So, you know, it needs to change from higher up and move its way through, because clinicians at the bedside, and I'm speaking for nurses and not necessarily, you know, doctors, but we're driven by policy, and as you said, we don't want to make a mistake. So we will accept technology once we've got policy and evidence to say that it's going to improve care and do those things. So yeah, I do agree. It's education, you know, of our organisations, that it's, you know, and it's organisations right down through to the grassroots, but that has to be enabled by wherever it is they're working.
Yeah. Sally, I think a couple of things from me just on that topic. One is that I think the, you know, to some extent, being a data scientist, we tend to sit at our computers and work, and so when we're not interacting with a clinician, we're sitting at a computer and working. When a clinician isn't interacting with a data scientist, they're probably seeing a patient.
Yeah.
So I think most data scientists have a real level of respect for the fact that these people, these clinicians, are treating patients, and that's in there, and you know, that's the bit we probably don't understand as well. You're in a rather unique position, I think, having both treated patients and now being on the data scientist side. And so I will say though that it comes back to the relationships you build, and so, you know, we've got as I said, we've been around for 17 years. We've built relationships with clinicians that, and it builds that level of trust, and so it's a really important part. And so, you know, when a clinician says, sorry, I can't make it, you know, the ones we've been working with, even recent ones but we've very quickly built that relationship, have, you know, we trust that, you know, something's come up and, you know, they can't make it, whatever, and so we've had to change plans. That's fine. But so I think it comes back to really building that trust and understanding between people. And so, you know,
Yeah,
I don't like to, you know, I wouldn't like to characterize any you know, the professions into different things like that. I think it's about the relationships we build.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that the more people who build those good long-term relationships, that means that there's a chance of changing the culture of each of the disciplines, so that there is mutual respect for what people have to offer, and across time. So that then it's not like you have to take 10 years to get to that point. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to build a relationship before finally you trust each other.
No, I agree.
What we want ultimately is that the cultures of the two disciplines will automatically fall into that pattern of okay, I understand where you might be time poor, blah, blah, blah. But the clinicians, by the same token, understand how valuable the work is, and the time and the effort that goes into producing scientific thought. So I guess it's just from having been on both sides of the fence, and I've suddenly gone, oh, okay, now I know why they hate us sometimes. Like, so I can see. And people are like, Sunday night, where's that plot? Like,
it's an observation you can make, Sally, but I probably couldn't.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks all of you. Some really great conversation came out of those questions. So it was very interesting. And just to add something, I think, listening from the outside, because I'm neither a data scientist or a clinician, but, you know, I can imagine that, you know, both sides, you know, the data scientist creating tools is emphasizing what it is what the benefit is to the clinician and to the patient, and making sure that things we develop, like I think Mingling, you touched on this, they're not just fancy tools for the sake of it, but what is the ultimate outcome, and communicating that very clearly to, you know, the clinicians, so that they can understand the benefit and maybe be more open to implementing those sorts of things. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so it'd be great to get some questions from the audience. We already have some people, some interesting comments in the chat. We did have our first question from Kelvin Ross, who most of us know, which is very relevant as well. So there was a recent COVID-19 study in The Lancet that implied the danger of prescribing hydroxychloroquine has been retracted. So the article, I don't know if anyone's read it, but it essentially said that it's dangerous to prescribe it for treatment of COVID. It actually had some negative outcomes for the patients, especially negative cardiac effects. But then it was retracted because the data collection company Certisphere was accused of fraudulently generating data. So, you know, that's pretty scary because, you know, that paper would have implications for clinical decisions on treating COVID. And now it's sort of coming out that the data that was used was not accurate or even possibly real. So Kelvin's question is, what mechanisms do we need to trust our medical data and insights derived from them? So I'll open it up to anyone to chime in on that one.
And maybe I will go first.
Yeah.
On this one. So yeah, it's a very good question, and we have been watching this news and following the study quite closely. And actually, that's the reason why we created the MIMIC-3 ICU EHR dataset in the first place, because we believe that open data and open source of your codes of a study can, to a certain extent, effectively prevent such scenarios. Because there are two kind of cases here, right? One is like these very unfortunate cases. Some scientists kind of intentionally manipulate some data to lead to some results. And in the other case, or more often the case, because clinical data inference or evidence generation from clinical data is a very complicated research field. But very often we may generate biases or involve biases in our study unintentionally. And then one thing we don't want to happen is that big data lead to big mistakes, right? That we reach wrong conclusions because some mistake that we make in our study. So we believe that the process is to open up your data, first of all, like what we have in MIMIC. At the same time, actually, if you read the data user agreement for MIMIC-3, we highly encourage anyone to conduct study or publish paper using MIMIC-3 to also release their source codes while they publish the paper. Right? The objective is not talking about IP and things like that, but rather so that we allow the other scientists who can go in and now and actually examine or help you to examine the potential biases that may be there in your study, and also to examine your codes and see whether there's any gaps or any bugs in your codes that may lead to wrong conclusions. So it's not really about challenging each other, but rather a very healthy open source and open data community kind of thinking where each others help out each others. And even for ourselves, right? If we have some bugs in our code, we will be very happy, even with MIMIC data. We have errors and bugs and all sorts of not really biases, but data errors in MIMIC. And we constantly receive feedbacks from our community and telling us that, oh, we saw this unsensible data and MIMIC that you guys probably want to fix it. And we are very happy for that to happen. And that's that community and the whole effort is what we believe that may help to prevent some of this from happening in future. Thanks.
Great. Does anyone else have any comments on that?
I guess just a point with the hydrochloroquine. I mean, that was a pretty extreme case, the Lancet hydrochloroquine. I mean, they made up data and they had no ethics approval. And so there were lots and lots of red flags that the journal really should have caught. And it's not that easy to get a medical study that collects data off the ground. You've got to have ethical approval, and that's a very easy thing to check. It's very easy to check whether a study has got ethical approval and what that ethics is for and what the study is allowed to do within the remit of that ethics. I think obviously the biggest problem is it would be wonderful if we could just make data publicly available, because then we can validate everything independently. And that would be the ideal from a scientific point of view, but for obvious reasons, data privacy is a huge can of worms that the digital health community is trying to navigate through. And what's been extremely interesting is seeing how things have changed in this COVID era. So certainly agreements have been made and data's been shared and things have happened that I would never have thought possible 12 months ago, because we realise we know nothing about this disease, people are dying, we have to be more prepared to share data, be prepared to, you know, take away the key identifiers, their name and their date of birth and things like that. But we should be able to share and store health data that doesn't have those kind of key identifiers in. And that, you know, that's obviously a very big question. In terms of, you know, what mechanisms do we need to actually trust the medical data? There's so many levels of trust, because it's also, as Morning was saying, it's that actual data entry and the number of errors. And I when you're talking about the Mimic3, I looked at the Mimic3 and I was like, oh, it's full of holes and there's all this missing data and there's all these outliers. And now looking at our COVID data, it's, you know, it's pretty messy. We do, like, a lot of our job is cleaning data and going back to sites and going, I'm sure you didn't mean a temperature of 150 degrees. And I'm sure that person wasn't actually 30 centimeters tall with a weight of 120 kilos. I really think you might want to check those results. And that's just all the time. So, I mean, trusting medical data, I guess the mechanisms we need are just to maybe have some protocols around all that aspect of how do you check data errors? Can you go back to users? How many iterations do you do this before everyone goes mad? I'm not sure. But I think that's all we're thinking about.
Yeah, look, I think there's also levels of trust, which are pretty standard actually in health now. You know, systematic review is of you know, the top standard, and randomized controlled trials are below that, and then a single paper of some data analytics might be below that. And so the real question is, how do we make sure that we can get our clinical guidelines and the best evidence from all the literature which gets published in a safe and credible way? And look, that's a pretty interesting area of AI research at the moment. We're doing some work with Paul Glasio at Bond University, who does a lot of work in the development of systematic reviews. And so he will say that he would like to see the day where we can produce a personalized systematic review in 2 minutes based on the literature using all these fancy AI technologies. Now, we're nowhere near that, but we are, you know, one of my information scientists have been working with Paul on making sure that initial query, which then some of the tools his team, Justin and co, have built at Bond University, process to extract information which inform clinical guidelines. And so there's a whole suite of tools, and most of them open source, being built in that area, where and in fact, Sally, some work we're doing with the University of Queensland as well, and is involved with us and Paul in that research. And so I think, so bringing it back to the question, is, you know what you're looking at, right? You know, this was a single paper. You know, we had a president telling us that this drug was great months ago. and I'm not convinced that was based on any evidence. So a bit better taking one paper, but we really need to be looking for those RCTs and systematic reviews to really provide the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lucy, did you have any comments on that one? No.
No, you're probably running out of time anyway, so.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, thanks for acknowledging that. We have 1 minute left. So yeah, unfortunately, we have lots of great questions and discussion in the chat. So we will get that to all the panelists, and if they're able to respond to any questions in there. So thanks for everyone for contributing those. Sorry, we don't have time to answer them all. So yeah, we will finish up there. I just have to say, excellent discussion. It was fascinating. So thank you all for coming along and having those discussions and giving us the input. And yeah, I think the message really is that we need to continue to link data scientists and clinicians and start having those conversations and making those connections so that we can really transfer the two fields across to each other and create some really powerful tools that benefit both parties, really.